Hi, I'm Chris Harrison and welcome to the live webinar part of our Assessment for Learning MOOC. I'm here today with Andrea Mackelbeck and one or two other people who are doing all the various IT parts, and we hope that everything's going to go fine. However, if we do have any problems or fire alarms or anything like that, don't worry, because what we'll do is we will still carry on and record all of this, and there will be an address put up later where you can actually see the recording. But here's hoping we manage to go live. Unfortunately, Dylan can't be with us today. He's travelling at the moment, and so we couldn't get a good connection with him via the internet. However, he has had several of the questions and has written responses, which I hope to incorporate into my responses when we come to the questions. So, are we ready to begin? I've got a whole host of questions that came in on time and some that were sent in late, the usual things, so that's fine. And we'll work our way through. There's not really any structure to what we're doing. We're just taking question by question. And if you've got more questions that you want to send in, please do, because Andrew and others are here picking those up and they'll try and feed them to me in the hour and a half that we've got. So let's start off. So our very first question is from Wendy Davison. And what Wendy asks is, how do we change pupil attitudes to take more ownership of their learning and prevent the talking amongst themselves being irrelevant? Well, this is something that happens in most classrooms, Wendy. When I was a teacher, it happened in my classroom too. And what I see really good teachers doing is gradually training their students in a way that they become much more involved in the dialogue. And this sometimes involves setting a task that they've got to do partway through the talk, that if they do start talking about irrelevant things, they won't manage to do the task. Or it's really about setting the questions that's going to really interest them and really motivate them. So all the good things that good teachers do fits in with this course as it does with any other teaching. But you have to work at it, and it takes time sometimes to win some groups over. The next one we've got is from Aldrich Baltic, and what he asks is there a way to override negative impacts on motivation to learn, and are students able to learn, not just pretend that they're learning without external motives? For me, this one just reminded me of Carol Dweck's work and trying to create classrooms where there's a growth mindset. There's been lots of people who have been talking online about Carol Dweck's work, and if you haven't seen her work, please go on YouTube and have a look at it, because she's really good at explaining what it's all about. But also she's wrote a most amazing book called Self Theories in 2000. I think it's actually better than her later ones. That's well worth reading. But basically it's about children coming to learn through seeing the things we value in the classroom. If we value them improving, then putting effort into improve, rather than just valuing performance, that we actually value learning rather than performance, after a while they get the idea and start to do that. The problem sometimes is that for some children, maybe in their past history in school, they picked up the idea that they were stupid, that they couldn't actually get involved with the learning. It's what Carol Dweck calls learned helplessness. And these are much harder to try and integrate back into the learning. But again, if you keep at it and keep those values high, you do usually persuade and cajole even the most reluctant learner to take part. And once they start realising their learning through working in that way, then there's no stopping them. And they just go on and become those lifelong learners that we want. So, next question. This is from Jade Smart. This is one that's come up quite often, actually, as we've been reading through the comments you've been making over the last few weeks. And what Jade's question is, it's about practicality in the classroom. And what she's actually asking is that when she thinks AFL is very important within lessons, she asks how often should we include some of the techniques discussed so far? Well, there's not really an answer to that one, Jade. It's like asking how long's a piece of string, really. You need to use the strategies as and when needed. What we're doing in the classroom when we're trying to create these experiences where we have intentional dialogue is we're trying to collect evidence of learning and evidence of part learning, because it's that we need in order to decide on those next steps. So we're trying really to create the best experience where we can pick up that information and then respond to it. So I've come to look at assessment for learning really over the past year or so as being responsive teaching. So you're creating that evidence so you can have responsive teaching. And you may need strategies for that, because you may need to enhance that feedback loop. So you may need to have traffic light cups, or you may need to do think, pair, share, so you can listen into them talking. There's all sorts of techniques you may need. Or your classroom may be working well enough anyway, the learning behaviours of your students may be good, and so you don't need any strategies at all. But it's the collecting the evidence and your response to it that's important. That's what assessment for learning is about. So I hope that helps. Okay, we're moving on now to Lisa Clark, and she's asking one that's I know is really pertinent for UK teachers now, or certainly for teachers in England, and that is about the levels going. We, in England, for those of you who are from outside the country, we have had for the last 10, 20 years a system where we measure how well children are doing in terms of levels and use that for reporting. And that the government have now decreed that should go, and there are good reasons why they should, but I won't go into those now. I think we're still working it out, is my first response to it, Lisa. But also what I think is important here is to think about, what are we doing when we assess? We're not really assessing to get a number or a level or a grade. We're actually assessing to find out what do children need next in their learning. So it might be that you need to look at both their increased complexity that they're actually working on in terms of their learning. You might want to be looking at the cognitive demands you're making through the tasks you're asking them to do and reporting on that. And you might want to look at their skill enhancement and how they're getting better with that, as well as the way they can communicate all that, so literacy and numeracy being important. And if you can do that and just say how they've improved from, say, the beginning of a term to the end of a term, or the beginning of the year to the end of the year, that probably will do the job. We don't need to code it in levels or grades. The Association for Science Education have been doing quite a lot of regional conferences on this, and it's well worth having a look on their website if you want to go and learn more about it, if you actually are in the UK. So I'm going now to one of the questions where Dylan has sent a response to, and this is Samir El Khatib's question, which is asking about getting AFL to work in large classes, and other people have asked similar things. I think AFL working in large classes means you've just got to work with your class in terms of finding the best way of collecting that evidence of learning. So Dylan's response is to use hinge point questions, and then to use a quick way of noticing who has got it or who hasn't. So he uses, the teachers he works with tend to use finger voting, where they put up one finger for A, two for B, and so on. And the teacher can quickly see not only the number who have got it right, but also the ones who are using the alternative ideas, and can then think on that evidence as to what to do next. Other people use electronic voting systems. They work quite well. The problem sometimes is, though, that you're not sure which children have answered the A, the B, the C, or the D, because it just gives you an overall 80% got it, 20% haven't. And that can be enough information for you to move on, or you might need more detail of who's answering what. Okay, we're going to move on now. I'm just going to move down on my laptop a little bit. Whoops, wait a sec. To the next one that we've got a response from both Dylan and myself. And that's one from Glenn Walsh and Eleanor Lyon-Taylor. And they're asking about the number of options there should be in a hinge point question, both the number of correct options, and other people have asked about the number of alternatives. This depends on the question you're asking, clearly, and also the amount of sophistication of your group. But you need to think about what the various misconceptions are around that particular topic, and those you use to form the alternatives. Having one or two correct answers is okay. However, what you are after are making sure that they get the right answer for the right reason. So framing those in such a way to get that is probably the best way to go about it. It's not an easy task, as you've probably found out. Writing good hinge point questions is quite a skill, but you do get better at it. We've had some more questions about hinge point. Just going up now to Catherine Watmer's questions. She's asking again, how many options in a hinge point question do you suggest to be effective? We need more than 2, but you know, it does depend, as I say, on the range of misconceptions. So something on photosynthesis might need 4 or 5 options if you're looking at it. Something on living, non-living might only need 3 options. It just really depends on what you're after, and you need to gear that into both the topic and to your learners. Another thing that Catherine asks about is, with a quick response time for hinge point questions, how do we check that pupils haven't just taken a lucky guess? Well, good hinge point questions, they shouldn't be able to do that. But I'm a little bit like you, Catherine, in that sometimes when I use a hinge point question, if I'm not too sure, if I think maybe they have guessed, or maybe they've guessed for another reason, I might just spend a little bit of time trying to unpick that with them and finding that out. Some folk, I've seen some teachers use confidence levels. So let's say they're asking a hinge point question, and then not only do they ask the student to put up or whether they're going to A, B, C, D, or E, but they also ask them to put a number out of 10 as to how confident they are. So if they're really confident that it's A and they've put 9 out of 10, and they're totally wrong, you have to think what you might do. Equally, if they put up an A and they say 3 out of 10, you might deal with that one differently when you're actually having your response. So that works for some teachers. It's just finding a way that works for you and your learners. Again, we've had several questions, and Catherine asked it here, but other people have asked as well. And that's about asking when's the best time to ask a hinge point question. On the course, we suggested that in the middle of a lesson or in the middle of learning was a good idea. And that's because in the middle of a lesson, the students have accessed into the learning and are thinking about the concept and well into it. So you actually really are more likely to tap in and probe their understanding at that time. Sometimes using it at the beginning of lessons can help, but sometimes kids aren't accessed in enough to really think and do well on it. And sometimes at the end of lessons, as many of you have said, they may not retain that thinking for the next lesson. They may go backwards a little way before they move forwards again. So we would suggest that part way through is probably the prime time in most cases, but you might want to use them in other parts of the lesson as well, and other parts of the learning if you think it might be useful. Let's move on, because we've talked a lot about hinge point questions, and take some of the others. So we've got one up here from Greg Seal, and that's asking about traffic lights, an AFL technique, very popular one actually. When getting students to use their red, amber or green, their understanding often falls into the middle ground. Would it be better to use 4 levels like red, amber, green and blue, as it would push them into making a less ambiguous choice? Well, you could, or you could just use red and green. It's, again, this is one of those strategies that's there to help the students feed back to you. And what we find is that students after a while don't use amber if the response to the reds, and they see that happening, that they get support, works well, and the response to greens is, are they really tested out to show that they can do it? So it's a matter really of coaching your students into using the traffic lights in the way that you want. So it can be just red and green, red, amber, green, or you could have all the colours of the rainbow if you liked. But it's really you finding that strategy that helps you to encourage the students to feed back to you honestly, which they do tend to do after a time if you use responsive teaching. Okay, let's move on. I'm going to go back to some of the questions that have come in before I go to the ones that came up on Twitter. So we've got one here which is asking about has anyone devised or carried out research into the use of intentional dialogue or devising hinge point questions in primary maths? Possibly. I haven't come across specific projects on primary maths, but I know from the primary projects, the assessment for learning projects that I've worked on with colleagues like Sally Howard, that we find that most primary teachers, certainly in England, Wales and the Channel Islands, tend to go for literacy as their first port of call when developing assessment for learning strategies, and then possibly into humanities or into science. Many of them do move on to maths, but it's not usually their first choice, and that might be something to do with the subject of mathematics, or it might be something to do with the teacher's confidence in trying something new in mathematics. However, that's not to say I've not seen excellent intentional dialogue in primary maths. I think design and technology is another one a bit like maths, which teachers possibly come to later or only a few teachers start with. But it can work in all subjects. It's just a matter really of working on it and getting your learners used to working on that type of approach within those lessons. Back to hinge point questions again, we've got Annie Manukian, who asks, can hinge point questions help to boost learners' autonomy and individual learning? Interesting one, and yet this isn't their initial purpose. This isn't what Dylan designed these for. They're really to collect that evidence of learning quickly. However, on sort of thinking about your idea, I can see it possibly being used as a revision tool towards the end of a topic maybe, so that the learners can decide where they need to direct their efforts. So what are the ones that I've got and can understand, and what are the ones where I'm not too sure about at the moment and I need to focus my revision time on, because usually students are not very good about portioning out the revision on the bits they're not so sure about, and yet that's really where they need to work. So I could see that working, and if you have a go at it, let us know. Put something up on the MOOC so we can all learn from that. Okay, we're moving on. So we've got one, this is coming via Twitter, and this is Quave Valquivez. It says, if an administrator would like to share assessment for learning with the faculty, what time-efficient approach would you recommend? Interesting. I've seen this happen in many schools, not necessarily from the administrator, but from one of the teachers that we've been working with who wants to spread assessment for learning possibly wider than their own department in a secondary school, a high school, or maybe into another year group in a primary school. And what they tend to do is they, and possibly a few colleagues, tend to try out the techniques and the ideas for a while, and then report back to the rest of the staff how that particular technique works within their school. Because for people new to it, or people who are maybe a little bit wary of making changes in the classroom, seeing colleagues getting it to work with children that they know is usually a winner to at least get them to have a go at something. So I certainly would suggest that. Your colleagues, even if they're not being persuaded to try it out yet, do need to be made aware of what you're trying to do if you are trying something new, and to have places to go and look at so they can actually update themselves on these ideas, so that when they do eventually feel confident enough to try themselves, they're ready prepped to do that and feel confident to do that. So thanks for that question. Another one here, again via Twitter, from Sergio Fabri. It says, I downloaded the whole document, Pedagogy and Practice. Are there specific materials for each discipline or area? Yes and no. Sorry, that's not a very good answer. The Pedagogy and Practice is really designed as a general thing, but there are other things that you'll find, particularly in science and maths, on the STEM Centre actual websites to have a look at. In terms of assessment for learning, Dylan and myself, along with Paul Black and Betha Marshall and Claire Lee, have produced booklets on many subject areas. So there's Inside the Black Box in science, in maths, in English, design and technology, modern foreign languages, geography, etc. So if you want to find out where to get those, again, go onto FutureLearn website and you'll be able to see where you can actually obtain those from. Moving on, let's go back to I think I missed one or two of the questions that came in. So I'm just going to quickly scroll through to see where we've got to with that. Some more here on the actual traffic lights, which I think we've sort of answered already. There's people here asking about some of the multiple choice, some of the hinge point questions have gone up already, and saying that some of them just seem to be like multiple choice checks on knowledge. Well, I've had a look at some of the things that people have put up, and yes, I'd agree some are. And it's a matter really of looking at them and thinking, am I just tapping into knowledge here with this hinge point question, or am I really tapping into understanding? Do I know not just what answer they've given, but why they've given that answer? Because a hinge point question will tell you why they've answered it as well. So it might mean that some of the questions maybe need a little tweaking before you use them in the classroom. As I said earlier, they're not easy to write. I wrote most of the ones that have come up as part of the course, and it took me quite a while with Andrew's and other people's help to do that. So keep working at it. Good hinge point questions. The more we've got, the more we can share, the better. Let's see what else we've got coming up here. Right. So, oh, we've got a lovely one here from Debbie Barker. She says, I understand that your work is very research-based. Yes, it is. What research have you not yet done in AFL but would like to see done if time and funding permitted? So I hope the funders are listening in here. For myself, my current interest is in teacher noticing. I'm trying to fathom out what teachers notice that they react to. And we all know in secondary schools, you know, if a physics teacher hears the word mass when the word weight should be used, or vice versa, they react to that. What do they notice that they then use as responsive teaching? Because that's where I think the real AFL lies. So what do they notice that they think about and try and do something about? What do they notice and ignore or leave till later, and why is that? And what do they not notice? And I think that's really interesting, because the teacher is the one that really controls that movement forward, particularly before your learners become self-regulating in their learning. And so working on what do teachers notice is quite important. In terms of what's needed for the actual research field, a big gap is we don't know a lot about how students respond to assessment for learning. We know that they like it because teachers have told us that, and we've seen that in classrooms as we've worked with teachers and students, and we've also got it from questionnaire data. We don't know much beyond that, and the only person really that has worked on this is a FAB researcher called Bronwyn Cowie, who works at Waikato University in New Zealand. And she's certainly worth reading if you can get onto the various research journals. And we certainly need to do more work on that. But for myself and for most of my team, we're still working a lot with teachers because of their important role in assessment for learning. Okay, lots coming in by Twitter. So we've got Faith Warren here, and she says, I see a lot of groups where formative assessment works really well. I can often see the group understand the topic at the time and can answer questions posed, and in the next lesson they recap very little. I want teaching staff struggle with this on a regular basis. What can I do to help? Keep working at it, I'm afraid. That does happen. Learners get so many experiences between one of our lessons and then the next time that we see them. And although they might edge forward in one lesson, they might slip back a little in another. So it's just the sorts of things that we've done before, really, which is to recap on learning and move them forward. And to ask them at times, I mean, a very good plenary that I've seen done by many teachers is just ask them what they've learned today. And sometimes you'll be surprised because they might not have learned what you've actually taught them. They might have picked up things that you didn't really think you'd emphasise, but they've picked it up because for them it seems important. And it's working with that and gradually moving them forward so that together you, the teacher and the learners, negotiate what's needed next. So that's why we need this intentional dialogue that we're so keen on. Okay, so Carey, Oh, and behind in my studies, is Rodden Driver a good source for misconceptions? All right, the answer is she's the best. All right, Ros Driver was at Leeds working on the Children's Learning in Science project for many years. She did her own PhD on what she called alternative conceptions. She doesn't call them misconceptions. She talks about alternative conceptions, which was a real, really changed the whole scene really to do with that type of work. We were very fortunate at King's, where I worked, to have her only for a few years before she unfortunately died of breast cancer. But in that time, she started all the work on argumentation that now Jonathan Osborne and Shirley Simon and others have picked up. And she's phenomenal. So going back to that original work, even though it started in the 1980s, it's still worth looking at. And although some people have built on it, again, some of the people at Leeds, Phil Scott, John Leach, Hilary Osoko and others, and there's been some work done in the States, it still is the leading area in terms of understanding children's misconceptions, particularly in science. So I'd definitely go back and look at Ross's work. It's fabulous. Here's Stephen Braithwaite asking about something happening in primary. How often should in-depth feedback be given in books? And should we expect them to reply to it every time? Yeah, this is a difficult one, isn't it? Because I know the practice in many primary schools is to collect, work in and give feedback on a regular basis. And sometimes that's every day or at least a couple of times a week in most subject areas. And that takes a lot of input from the teacher. But it also, if the student did respond to all of those, takes a lot of input from the learners. So I think it's particularly useful for the teacher to think of specific targets for their learner and to focus in on those. So it might be some children need to work on their maths for a few days, some might need to work on their literacy, some on their humanities, etc. To differentiate and diversify in that way might be a more useful way than having so many targets, which because they are trying to respond to all of them, they maybe do rather superficially. Okay. I've just had a sign from Andrea, my AIM assistant over here, who's keeping out a screenshot, and she says, can we have more on Twitter, please? So can we start tweeting, guys, so that we actually have got more coming in? Let me go back a bit and pick up some of the ones that have already come in that I've maybe missed. I don't think, Andrew, have we done the large class one yet? No. Okay, so several people have asked about how do you do assessment for learning with large classes? We did a little bit, okay. So one of the things I've seen teachers do really well with a large class, if they want to get dialogue going, whether we're talking about using it, so you've got talk before a hinge point question, or using it as an actual discussion question, is that sometimes they, instead of the teacher necessarily doing a whole class thing, the teacher trying to see what 40 or 50 children are thinking, they divide the class up into maybe 8 groups of 6 or something like that. And then the teacher flits round listening into the conversations. So the teacher's job is to actually try and harness what they're talking about, to try and listen in, find out what they're talking about, and then to use what they're doing in order to really sort of pull the next steps together. And one of the best ways I've seen this done is by using what the teachers call yes-no cards. And this basically is to maybe write a few questions or a few ideas that come from that particular topic. And each of the groups just work through the cards, looking the cards down one at a time, and they're saying, yes, I know something about this, or no, I don't know something about that. The no's they put aside, because it's no good dealing with something they don't know yet. And then with the yes ones, they'll have a smaller pile of yes cards to do with that topic. They then have to go round their group of, say, 6 students, and each of them say one thing about that topic that's to do with what's written on the card. So let's just say, for example, they picked up a card and it says poles of a magnet. Right? They each have to say something about poles of a magnet until somebody can't say something about poles of a magnet. And then they might ask a question if they can think of one. If not, just them just going through the things that they've actually said. If a teacher's listening in, the teacher can then pick out, which are the things they've definitely got, which are the things they're a bit sort of fuzzy about, which are the things they're definitely getting wrong. Now, the important thing in this lesson is that if you're working in this way, is not to do the thing which you feel you want to do, and that is to intervene and sort the kids out there and then. Just collect the evidence. Maybe, if you're like me, make a note of it so you don't forget for later. And then, possibly 20 minutes before the end of the lesson, then have a whole class discussion, pulling out those ideas that need sorting out. So the first 20, 30 minutes of the lesson, the children are talking with their yes/no cards, you're listening in. The next 20 or 30 minutes or so, you're either doing an activity that helps them sort out the things they're not so sure about that you've picked up, or you're doing a whole class discussion based on that. And this seems to work really well, because what you're doing is responsive teaching. You're responding to your learners' needs. So I hope that helps. I'm sure other people have got other ideas, other things they've tried. So again, tweet in, guys, or maybe put it up on the FutureLearn site another night so we can all learn from one another. Because it's only through seeing thousands of teachers now in classrooms over the last 20 years that we've picked up the things that really work and realised why they've worked. And that's at the base of what we do. Okay, great. Things are coming in via Twitter. So Mark Waller has asked, so HPQ, so hinge point questions you suggest halfway through learning, but it's useful if you can already see the class doesn't understand the subject. That's interesting. So I'm not sure you need a hinge point question if you already if they already picked up they don't understand it. If you've picked up they don't understand it, then maybe think about what you need to do to help them get that understanding, and then use your hinge point question. That's maybe what you mean, Mark. I think the thing we've got to be careful of is that hinge point questions are not there to punish the learners so they can always see what they're getting wrong. Hinge point questions are there for you to collect evidence of learning. And overuse of them, just like overuse of any type of exam question, can sometimes put some learners off. Even your high attaining learners who, if it's a really challenging question, sometimes high attainers don't want to do it just in case they get it wrong. They'll hang back, and you don't want hanging back. You want them to be honest about where their misunderstandings or fuzziness in their understanding is. Right, where are we now? So we've got Paolo Oprandi. How does your understanding of assessment for learning differ from good teaching? Well, if you're doing assessment for learning well, I'd say you were a good teacher. I always quote Philippe Perrenu, who's a Swiss researcher in this area, and he, in one of his papers, said that assessment for learning, or formative assessment as he calls it, disappears into the learning when it actually gets really good. In other words, it becomes a part of what you do. And again, when I watch teachers in classrooms, after a while, the sort of way that they respond to students just becomes a natural part of what they do. They don't have to think, right, I must do this now, or I must use that strategy now. It's just a natural thing of what they do. It becomes implicit in their practice. And that's when they become really good teachers, even if they were good teachers before. So, yeah, it's part of good teaching. There's other things to do with good teaching as well, though, as we all know. Okay, more coming in. So Joe Jacob here. Oh, yeah, struggling with writing hinge point questions. Yeah, I am as well. He says, do they work for non-STEM? Well, Dylan was the one who really went along the line of hinge point questions. The rest of the research team, he was working in the States at that time, and we were working still here in England. The rest of our research team went on developing questions that made children talk more, but he wanted to do it differently. And he works, I mean, you know, Dylan is a mathematician, and he got some very good ones in maths that he's put in some of the books that he's written. And certainly I've seen people use it really well on both in classrooms and when I've watched YouTube things. I'm just looking down now because he did actually answer something on this where he recommended a YouTube to go and see. I'm just trying to find that answer from him now. It was somebody from Harvard, I remember that. I'm trying to find the name of the person. Can you see it, Andrea?
Yeah, I'm looking.
I'm sure I've read this somewhere. Sorry, my memory is not with me tonight. We'll come back to that when we found it and we'll let you know. But there are some good things on YouTube, particularly in maths area. Andrea?
Eric Mazur at Harvard.
Eric Mazur at Harvard does this really well. So have a look at that. I've got a brilliant one for inquiry that Jonathan Osborne from Stanford wrote. So if anybody wants that, I'll put that up on the FutureLearn tomorrow, probably. It will be now. But a really good one, inquiry or working scientifically, as we call it now in England. So we've now got Eva Hartnell, who asks, do you have any suggestions on literature with examples of hinge questions? Oh, I've just answered that one. Dylan's books, the latest ones he's written, embedding formative assessment, and the other ones are well worth a read. They mainly are in books for teachers rather than in the research journals at the moment, because that's who Dylan is writing for quite a lot. This is one that's come from earlier on in the course, and it's from Glenn Walsh and also Amber Finn. Are there any key ways in which AFL strategies can be used to support differentiation, especially at post-primary level? More in terms of collecting the evidence, no. I think quite often with AFL, you're better, rather than trying to have an approach to differentiation where you're giving them lots of different materials. That's one approach to differentiation. The way you respond can be differentiated. So let's say, for example, you use a hinge point question or you use traffic light cups, and you find out that some children have understood about forces and acceleration and some haven't. The differentiation comes from what you do next. Sometimes it might be putting all the greens together and giving them one task, or the reds together for using traffic lights and then do a task, or the ambers together and give one task, a different task. So that might be what you decide to do in terms of differentiation. Another approach we've seen teachers do very effectively is to mix the greens and the reds, or the ambers and the greens, and get them to sort out the little problems they might be having while the teacher maybe deals with the children who said red. Similarly, you do the same with the hinge point question. So if A is the right answer and a few say B and a few say C, you might want to mix an ABC group to actually deal with that. So the response might be differentiated rather than necessarily the input. Oh, here's one about solo taxonomy. Do I think solo taxonomy is useful for AFL? Anything that gets us asking better questions. Asking questions is the key, I think, to getting dialogue working in the classroom. When we started off all those years ago, we tried to use Bloom's taxonomy, and it worked for some of our teachers, but not for all. And that's why we came up with things like question stems, or we came up with eventually hinge point questions. Anything that really helps is useful. So yeah, the solo taxonomy does work quite well, but you have to find the one that works for you, right? The one thing I would say, and it's the one thing I make my trainee teachers do, and that is write some of the questions in your lesson plan. It's hard to remember good questions and get them exactly right word-wise, and it's really hard to try and construct them when you're doing everything else in a lesson. So write questions down, and also share them. All right, so the best questions I've got have come from other teachers. There's one from Paul Spenceley, who was on our COMOFAC project 20 years ago. He asked, if plants need light to grow, why don't the biggest plants grow in the desert? A brilliant question for looking at adaptation, and not one I would have thought of. All right, and I've used it for the last 20 years successfully when I've been teaching that topic. So, you know, ask teachers, what's your, you know, when you're teaching this topic, have you got a good question? Because you'll be surprised just how many good questions teachers have, and they don't realise what amazing questions they are. Sorry. That's all right. I've been told to slow down, so sorry guys, I do talk at a rate when I get talking about assessment for learning. It's one of my faults, so I will try. Thank you for that tip, Seb. Okay, so we're now going on to Rosie Cat. Lovely name. All right, I hope it's a real name and not a made up one, but I do love it. He's asking, could Dylan add some hinge point questions on the course site for maths? All right, we'll ask him. He's travelling at the moment, but we will ask him if he can do that. I've got 8 really good maths teachers on another project I'm doing on inquiry. I might ask them if they can come up with some as well, because it'll be good for them to do that. So we'll see what we can do. We know we need to add more maths things. We focused on science at first, and we've gradually put some maths in. So we'll try and do some on that. Thanks for that, Rosie. Right, so Carrie's back again. AFL has been around for a while. Do you think it's been incorporated well into teacher training and schools? Yes, in some places. All right, I hope the people who are training at King's College, where I work, thinks it's well incorporated. Similarly, in some schools, but it doesn't always stay. Teachers move on, pressures get such that teachers sometimes revert to old habits. You do need to keep working at it. So, you know, it's not something that's going to come and go. Gillen and Paul wrote Inside the Black Box, and the research that goes with that in 1998. So we're talking about a long time we've been working on this, and we've still got a long way to go. So keep returning to it. I go back and read Inside the Black Box a couple of times a year. And just a tip for you guys, and that is, if you haven't got time to read 20 pages of a small A5 booklet, there are 5 paragraphs that we put in bold for the very busy teacher. So if you're really stuck for time, read those 5 paragraphs and think about how you use them in the classroom. Because the more you think about it, the more you work on it, the better you'll become as a teacher, and the better assessment for learning will work for your students. So we've now got Dave. It's a similar question, really. So it says AFL isn't new, yet it isn't widely understood in this profession. What keeps high quality AFL out of schools? Other pressures? Also, some teachers have not been like some of you guys have been on this particular course, in that they take the ideas and maybe will try it out once or twice, and maybe it doesn't work quite as well as they hoped, and then they give up. What it seems from the reports we're getting back from you is that you're really working at it, really trying to get it to work in the classroom, and that's what we need. It's actually experimenting with it, find out what works, reflecting on it, going back and trying again, and realising that your learners change. So what your learners were like when you started this course several weeks ago, they're different as learners now, and so their needs will be slightly different. Just as the content changes, their needs, their learning behaviours change as well, and you have to adapt to that. You're the one that's actually controlling the movement forward at this stage. Eventually, your learners will become so good at learning that they're going to learn in spite of you. All right, even if you haven't got time to do things, they're going to learn because they are going to get so eager. So keep working at it. It certainly takes a while. We found on our various projects, initially it was taking a good 8 months, year and a half. We now see teachers moving classes quite dramatically in 5-6 month periods if they really work at it. But it doesn't happen overnight. So I think the reason it doesn't happen always in schools is that teachers sometimes get waylaid, focused on other things because of the pressures in many schools. So, you know, the smart teacher finds ways of overcoming those pressures and working on assessment for learning. Hope that's helpful. It's not a great answer, but it's one that I believe actually is true to the situation. Okay, so got Helen Rogerson. Hello, Helen, I know you well from ASE. Very conscious of classroom talk as a result of week 2. Any strategies for getting departments talking about intentional dialogue? Usually sort of those unique bits. I'm sure you've got some students in your class that maybe other teachers would think surprising or even amazing if they responded well to a question or gave a particular insightful answer. So little sort of tips like that, little tips and snippets like that, where they can, you can actually show some of your learners responding differently to how they might expect them, really does help other teachers think it's worth having a go. Otherwise, sometimes they think, well, you know, these ideas have come in and gone before, maybe they're not going to work for me, or maybe I haven't got time to do them. But if they see they're really helping your children learn, they're usually more willing to have a go. Okay,
So Stephen Braithwaite's here again. What are some good examples of the language we should teach pupils so that peer assessment is a worthwhile activity? Whew, that's a big one. To get peer assessment working well, we've not really focused on that in this particular work that we're doing, because we're really working on just the intentional dialogue part. But you need to get the talk right before you get peer assessment working really well. You also need to model feedback yourself very well, so they learn what to value and what not to value. And it's also getting them used to language in the classroom. So, for example, I don't allow my trainee teachers to use the word marking. We have a joke where we say that marking is what animals do to territories, and we don't want to do that to children's work. But what we do is use the word feedback. So you say, right, I'm collecting in what you've done, what you've had a go at, to give you feedback. We also try and not call it work. We say, I'm collecting in what you've had a go at, I'm collecting in your ideas that you've put down. So again, it's not associating it with something that maybe is toilsome. It's something that, we are interested. We're interested in your ideas. We're interested in your thoughts. So we're going to collect in your ideas and thoughts, and we're going to give you some feedback. And then when you start giving feedback, you have to get the whole action of giving them time to respond and then realising the values of that. If all those things are in place, peer assessment is an easy next step. And one of the things that we've seen in classrooms is that students will actually accept comments and language from other students that they won't expect from a teacher. So if one child says to another, I can't read that, it's really badly written, it's loads of rubbish, but it's really badly written, they won't get upset about that. They will look at it and say, yeah, I'll do something about that. We'd never say that as a teacher. All right, but they'd accept that from a peer and possibly do something about it. So don't get too worried if the language and the talk maybe isn't quite the same that you would use. I mean, clearly we don't want children to be put off learning by other peers or other peers to be particularly cruel, but the language they use with one another is different to what a teacher would use with a learner. And it's just sort of finding that acceptable level and working towards that. So I hope that's useful. As I say, we're not really focusing on peer assessment. Maybe we need to do another MOOC on that. Who knows? Thumbs up from Andrew, that or not. But it is one of the things that we possibly need to work on after we've got the language sorted out, after we've got the talk sorted out. So here we've got one that we didn't deal with that was submitted earlier on the course. This one is from Sidi Mohammed. Why is it that some students do not understand explained facts by the teacher in the classroom to their lowest level? They don't, because facts, don't necessarily portray that whole understanding of science. So through the discussion and through the activities that you do, both practical and otherwise in the classroom, learners come to develop an understanding. So they might not remember facts, but they will remember how various activities went and try and make sense of those. So possibly it's thinking about the way that you're presenting the work and getting them to then apply those ideas in various contexts. And that might help CD. There's lots of ideas on that from various people, not just from us, if you look at various things to do with active learning, and I hope that's helpful. So here we've got Patricia Devlin. So I'll just have a quick drink. How do I keep going when the course is over and keep up with the other pressures? Pace yourself. What we found was worked well, both Andrew and myself, when we've been working with teachers live, so we're doing professional development live, is to get teachers to think about something to work on with a group within a particular time frame. So let's say I want to work on my questioning over the next 3-4 weeks. What you need to do when you do that is to say, and what will I expect them to be like after that 4 weeks? How will they be different to what I'm doing now? Because you will then be able to monitor that and see what progress that they've made. And it's surprising how really sort of insightful that is into understanding what's going on if you actually set that small target for yourself and think about what you're going to look for. It also is really useful in explaining to other colleagues just how things are working and why things work in classrooms. So, you know, that might be something that you might do. The other thing is to buddy up with somebody, either in your school or maybe via the MOOC, and to just sort of keep in contact with them and regularly talk to one another about how things are going, and that will keep you going past the course. We all need sometimes that other person to just edge us on a little, because, you know, life as a teacher is really busy. It was when I was a teacher, and that's quite a few years ago now. So here we've got Miss Bell. There's a huge focus on marking written work. Do you think it's easy to balance this with quality discussions and hinge point questions? Well, again, we're not really looking at feedback on written work in this particular MOOC. It is important, but I would say, and I'm sure Dylan would as well, that the quality discussions and the hinge point questions are absolutely vital for helping us decide on those next steps. It's where most of the evidence is of the learning. You might pick up some from what they've written, but you probably won't pick it up quickly enough to do something about it, because by the time they've done the work, handed it into you, you've had time to look through it and think about the feedback. That might take 3 or 4 days. Talking the lesson and hinge point questions give you that immediate feedback, so you can either deal with the problem there and then in the lesson, or you can deal with it the next time that you see them, which might be the next day. So for more immediate feedback, hinge point questions and discussion, supplemented probably by looking at the sorts of things they're producing for homeworks, etc. We've got one here from Firas Ogayat. Is it secure to change my planning class when I get the evidence of not understanding because of hinge point questions? Yes, that's what you're doing. All right, so don't worry that if you think you've got a brilliant plan, if the learners aren't with you on that plan and you spot it, do something about it. That is the key. So well done for spotting that. Jason King here. He says, I'm just a teacher. Don't know what that means, Jason. Teachers are brilliant people. How can I turn the mindset of the senior leadership team to believe in and give time to AFL for all teachers? Hard on this. I'm sure in their hearts, your senior leadership team do believe in assessment for learning. They just sometimes get sidetracked doing other things. That's my interpretation anyway, of colleagues I know who are in senior leadership teams. I think it's worth reminding them of the literature. I think it's definitely worth reminding them that in the studies like our own, the first one that Dylan, Paul and I did, where we looked at how the children in the maths and science classrooms in Medway and Oxfordshire that we're working with did, compared to children who were just doing so-called ordinary learning in the classroom, they did significantly better in the classroom. You also have to look, I mean, one of the things that sways senior leaders is to look at John Hattie's work. John Hattie's written a book called Visible Learning, which most senior leadership teams have bought a copy of, and quite a few of them I'm sure have read it. But he looks at effect sizes. Again, it's looking at how certain interventions have worked compared to not doing that intervention. You look at the top ones in terms of what has got the highest effect size. You've got feedback, you've got teacher-pupil relationships, you've got various other things that all come underneath the umbrella of assessment for learning. So certainly the research evidence is there that will maybe sway that senior leadership team. The trouble is then getting them to prioritise, because many senior leadership teams say, yes, you're right, and they'll try and make you do that as well as all the other things that they've decided you've got to do. So talk to senior leadership team. I'm sure that you can convince them if you get your actual pitch right. So on STEM maths again, do you think it should be a whole school focus to get the students in that mindset as well as teachers? Well, yeah, that would help. However, in many of our projects, it's sometimes been one department in science or maths or humanities that have moved it forward. Sometimes in a couple, a few schools. In our original project, we had 6 schools. Only one of those took it whole school. So If you can, yes. If you can't, it doesn't mean don't do it. Even one teacher working with one class could have a significant effect on those learners. So we've now got Julia Ruth Alexander. Our school has introduced positive behaviour at school and encouraged the use of rewards, much like gold star ideas. Will this conflict with our efforts as assessment for learning? It depends. If you're going to give a gold star for getting things correct and only for getting things right, or only for those who are likely to get things right, then it would conflict. But I've seen teachers use reward systems where students will get the gold star for improving, for saying this piece of work is better than that one because, and then they get a gold star for it. Or they've got it because they've read the feedback and done something about it. That's what they get their gold star for. So it depends what they're getting their rewards for. Reward the things that you value. Reward for improvement, reward for them taking an active role in their learning, reward for them actually doing something about getting better at things rather than for just getting things right. Then it should work well. It should help assessment for learning rather than hinder it. Here we are with Claire McLean. Are you concerned that hinge point questions will become mandatory and perhaps misused in the manner of learning intentions? Yes. It's quite interesting. If you go back to England and look at the national strategies, who did make a valiant attempt to get assessment for learning working in classrooms, but it says in there that research says that learning intentions help. When I actually asked them whose research, they said yours, and I said, but our teachers on the first project didn't use learning intentions. That came later. Somebody decided that might be. We said what you need to do is to make children aware of what they're going to be learning and how they can be successful. And that was then interpreted by some people into learning intentions. Learning intentions used well, and some teachers do use them really well, work well. Just having a rule that you have to learning intention on the board every lesson and the kids have to stick it in their books or write it in their books is not the purpose of learning intentions. Right? It's just a job, so I wouldn't advise that. So if hinge point questions works in a purposeful way, great. If they became, it's just something that you do, then yeah, they will actually not work as they're meant to do. So always, as in any teaching, think of what you're doing and why you're doing it, and make it work for the purpose it was intended for, rather than for some alternative purpose, and you'll be okay. All right, so it's thinking about what you're doing. And I know that's hard sometimes for a busy teacher in the classroom when they're told do this by senior leaders or by some sort of coach or something. Always ask them why and talk it through and think it through if you're not sure, and then you'll be fine. Okay, so we've got questions about practicalities again. This is Eva. Would it be possible to follow this course later on? I think so. I'm looking around at people.
The access to the materials will still be there afterwards, as far as we know.
Right. I don't know if you heard that from Andrea. She said the access to the materials should be there when the course is finished. But we will check on that. I think that's going to be the case. Sometimes I know, having looked at other FutureLearn courses, that courses are sometimes repeated as well at various times. So, you know, there will be follow-up. And certainly Dylan and myself are quite happy not to feel huge amounts, but if, you know, people sort of want to be directed to things that they've lost that we've put up, we can certainly do that after the course, even if it's not there on the regular site. So we've got Colin Jackson now. He's talked about hinge point questions again. Still feeling that a good hinge point question would allow him to check that misconceptions have been overcome. But most of those I have read seem to be multiple choice. Oh, we've talked about this one already. Yeah, I think I don't use hinge point questions to check misconceptions have been overcome. I use them at a point in the lesson where I'm not sure. If I think that they've been overcome by the way that the students have reacted through the activity, I find I don't need them again, because the talk through the activity and what I've got them to do during the activity, in reaction to their earlier hinge point question answer, usually tells me enough that they've got it. But if you want to use them as checks, then that's fine. And as we said earlier, one of the intentions of this course is to have a better bank and repository for hinge point questions, so we can actually share them and tweak them and get them better as the actual course goes on, and we all learn more about it. So, you know, keep sending in the hinge point questions, even if you're not too sure how great it is, because maybe another teacher can actually adapt it for you and get it to work a little bit better. Sometimes it needs several pairs of eyes on it. We certainly work as a team, very rarely as individuals, when we're working on these sorts of things. So we've got Stuart Lloyd now. What strategies can you give to help students in a class become more aware of their own abilities to the extent which, presented with tasks with variable levels of challenge, they are able to pick an appropriate one? Okay, yeah, I don't like the term abilities. I usually talk about capabilities, but that's fine. That's just the way we refer to things. So how do we get children to know which work they should actually select? Well, usually I find in most teachers' classrooms, it comes first of all by trial and error. So let's say a teacher's actually put things on different coloured cards. So you've got pink cards and blue cards and yellow cards. And maybe a student will start on a yellow card and realise, this is a bit too easy for me. So they move up to the pink card. And that's fine. And, you know, you've got to allow them to do that. Or maybe they'll start on a yellow card and realise it's too difficult for them. So they need to sort of slip back to the blue card for that particular topic. Getting them into the mindset whereas, you know, in some topics I'm going to find some bits a little bit harder than maybe some of my peers. In other bits I'm going to find it a bit easier. And I should really be trying to key myself in as to what I actually need. It is important. So setting up that safe learning environment is really important. I really like that comment that is in that Margaret Heritage paper that we put up, where she talks about creating that safe environment for learners, where children can learn with and from one another. And I think they do that when they're doing that selection of work. If you respond to them talking to one another about which particular one that they should do, and if they're not sure, then, you know, say, ask me and I'll suggest what you might try, what might suit you this lesson, and we'll gradually tailor it so that it's actually working for you. As long as they're getting that idea that you're trying to respond to their needs and not that you're trying to catch them out to see whether they can really do that pink card, then they're going to be fine on that. Easier in primary because you've got them usually for longer and they're more used to you in the way that you work than possibly for high schools, where you might only get them for 3 hours a week or 1 hour every day. However, it is worth gradually getting that to work in your classrooms so that they then in the end do become what we all want, and that is to become self-regulated learners, where they know what they need and what to go for and know which bits to leave. Right, several have come in. So we've got Charlie Bamford. This is one again submitted earlier on the course, so thanks for that, Charlie. Any good ideas promoting self-assessment for very young learners or those with SEN, where they haven't yet developed sophisticated evaluative skills? Oh, that's a big one. What I've seen teachers do, well, if I tell you first of all about how I've seen particularly very young learners be brought into intentional dialogue. They need that first before they start really getting to self-assessment. On our Welsh project, the one we did in Carmarthen and gosh, where else? Bangor, Ceredigion, sorry, Wales. So Carmarthen and Ceredigion, we saw teachers with very young children when they were doing things like, say, reading a book where the children were sitting on the carpet and they had a big book, maybe hopefully, sometimes it was a science book, sometimes it was just an ordinary reading book. And what they did was to give out the children question cards. So some children had a question that was a when, that said when on it, some had a why, some had a what. And what the teacher would do partway through the story, let's say it's the hungry caterpillar, she would stop and say, I think we could do with a what question now. And the children had got what questions, would talk to the partner next to them, and they would come up with a what question. the teacher would maybe take 3 or 4 what questions, and the other children would then try and answer them. And then she'd move on with the story and stop again and say, perhaps we need a when question now. And again, the young children would talk with their partner, come up with some when questions, and the other children would then try and answer them. So they were gradually brought into the way the teacher wanted them to behave in using intentional dialogue in the classroom. And yes, sometimes they did come up with weird questions, but part of what the good teachers did that we saw was to actually use that as a learning as well. So one I remember, this was around Christmas time, was they were doing the story of the Nativity, and one child asked what was the name of the sheep in the stable, which didn't help taking the story of the Nativity forward very much at all. But for that child, they wanted to know what was the name of that sheep. And they talked about it, you know, it might be something you want to know, but does it help the story? And it was quite interesting how just that little nudge about what to do, when later questions were asked, they did actually focus much more on the story of the Nativity rather than just the first thing that came into their head. So yeah, the good teacher gets intentional dialogue going and then starts thinking about how to do the peer and self-assessment. If you want to read more about work in primary, then maybe our book that Sally Howden and I wrote, Inside the Primary Black Box, might be useful for you. The other person that's a good read for primary is Shirley Clark, who's written quite extensively in this area. So, where are we now? Claire McLean, back to hinge point questions. Certainly having them recently on as tasks to do has highlighted the need to focus on these. So that given that hinge point questions will show knowledge at that time, but not necessarily that the knowledge will be retained. Oh, we're back to this one again. Is an argument for repeating the same hinge point question at spaced intervals? Possibly, but don't overuse them. It's back to this thing again that we've come up with on several of the points so far. It's thinking about when is their best use, when I can collect evidence, and don't use them just for other things you need to do, because they're so important for collecting that evidence for the right reason. We've got Oliver Amato here. We agree that AFL may revolutionise teaching and learning. How effective are hinge point questions in improving exam results? Don't think anybody's done that study yet. It might be one that people would look at. My team aren't going to look at it because we've got other things. We're still trying to work out the whys and how things work. We believe it does work, and certainly, you know, hinge point questions, Dylan's seen working terrifically well with teachers. We've seen it working well with some teachers. I'm still to be convinced myself, always in primary, just how good they are, but that's possibly because I'm not a primary specialist and I haven't been able to invent some really good ones for primary myself yet. But I think the more we learn about how to use hinge point questions and see them work in the classroom, the better we'll get. And maybe somebody out there wants to do a PhD looking at use of hinge point questions and the exam results. If they do, contact your local university. I'm sure you'll find a good tutor there that can actually help you with that. But that research isn't being done at the moment in terms of quantitative research, but we are looking at qualitative stuff. So this is via the Google Hangout, and this is Jessica Harvey. How can I adapt AFL for 16 to 19-year-olds GCSE maths resit students? I see once a week for 2 hours. Get the talk going in all the ways we've mentioned on the course so far. And when you've got that going, one of the things, and there's a study, you need to go back to our 1998 Inside the Black Box to look at the details of this. But there was a study done where they looked at students, GCSE, so slightly younger, but GCSE students, who some of them were working on exam papers for the few months before their exam. Some of them, having worked on exam papers for a week or two, the teacher then got the students to devise exam questions and answers themselves and then share them and try one another's. The group who devised the exam questions actually did better than the group who just practiced the exam questions. All right. If you can also get the intentional dialogue right before they do that, I would predict they do even better. So if you want to look at that paper, go back and look at inside the black box and look for that particular study. If you can't find it, contact me or contact the MOOC, and we can actually get those details to you. It's quite an old study now, 1990 something, but it is worth having a look at. So we've got Oliver Amoto again. Thanks, Oliver, for sending in more questions. How does a teacher avoid overdoing the dialogue in a classroom, which could slow down the pace of the lesson? I don't think you can overdo it, Oliver. I think if you've got to think of the pace of the lesson being correlated with the learning that's taking place. That's what you've got to do. So it's not the amount of the curriculum I get through, but how much of the learning has moved forward. And you'll know that only from having good discussion and dialogue in your classroom. I know it sounds a bit twee to say that, but when you see it happening in classrooms, it's so clear and evident. And teachers feel that it's well worth spending that time on the dialogue. It's not wasted time. It's time when you sort out the learning, sort out the understanding, so you don't have to keep going back to it. If they really do understand how to, balance an equation in chemistry, or work out how to do crossovers in genetics, or whatever it is that they're doing, or really understand what happens when you dissolve a solute in a solvent, then you don't have to keep going back. They will not just remember it, they'll understand it. Yeah, you can't overdo it. You can just get better at doing it, I think is my answer to that one. So we've got another returner here. We've got Sergio Fabri. Did you notice making students to work in groups is related to the cultural environment or country? Yes to both. I mean, certainly it's also subject culture. So you find that some subjects in school lend themselves better to dialogue than others at first. So, certainly humanities tend to be very good at getting dialogue going, as does English or any language, if it's obviously French if you're in France. So there's that. Also, it is different. We've got the projects. I've got 2 pan-European projects at the moment where we're looking at assessment of inquiry, of which assessment for learning, formative assessment, is key in that. And one's a 12-country and one's a 9-country project. So certainly when I look at videos, or sometimes I visit some of my colleagues in other countries, I see that the culture is different. And working with that, still getting the dialogue going, but working within those frames of culture is fine. It can still improve things. And we've worked certainly in many countries now. States, we've had a project, Channel Islands. I've done quite a lot of work in various places, including Malawi and Nigeria, as well as many places across Europe. So, it does work, but it does work differently, and it's a matter of trying to tweak them and thinking purposely about how you use them. So culture is important. And again, going back to Bronwyn Cowie, whose work I mentioned earlier from Waikato, she takes a very socio-cultural approach to assessment for learning, particularly since she's in New Zealand, and the whole respect for the Maori ideas that they've got in New Zealand really has sort of highlighted that for her. So she's well worth a read if you're interested in cultural perspectives, as is Jill Willis from Australia. Right, we've got a long question here from Julia Ruth Alexander. So I'm just scanning it quickly. Oh, it's about parents. Yeah, parents look for exam marks. I don't always understand what's going on if things change in classrooms. You do need to educate parents. They want what's best for their learners. They tend to react because things are maybe different now to what it was like when they were in school. And so it's a matter really of communicating with parents about what you're doing and why you're doing it. We usually find it's best to sort of get going with it a little bit and then tell them, because sometimes they're suspicious early on and question you a lot when you're not ready to sort of answer all the things that they want to ask you about. In terms of educating them, some of my favourite ones have been the project we had in Jersey in the Channel Islands, where some of the teachers actually changed their displays in their classrooms to educate the parents. So instead of having sort of the wonderful display of the children's best work, they actually had one board in their classroom near the door where the parents came in to collect the children. It was called the Learning Board, where they would publish the children's work and comments from the children about what they were doing and why they were doing it, and children's work at different stages in the learning, with comments from the kids about why it was that this was better than the previous piece, and so on. And it was amazing the interest it actually created. And even in the early years classroom, the nursery classroom, the teacher had the great idea of getting the children to take photographs of things that they were doing, and then the teacher would put up, or the TA would put up, sort of an explanation of what it was about. And I think my favourite one was early on when they got these 4-year-olds to take photographs of one another of what good sitting and bad sitting meant when they were sitting on the carpet. And it was hilarious how they did that and put it up. And it gradually moved on to, you know, what is good writing or compared to another. And I remember one of the little girls sitting with me and telling me quite painstakingly how her writing had got better. And she explained that her g's had now got long and lovely curly tails, but sometimes her t's still jumped above the line. You know, and this is a project I did 10 years ago. It still sticks in my mind how this was a 5-year-old could actually explain the improvements that she needed and the targets that she'd actually got. If they can do that at 5, imagine what they can be like by the time they're 14, 15, 16 if we keep this going. So it is well worth educating parents so that they don't get the wrong idea. They will love it once they know what it's there for, particularly since kids get better exam results when you've got good assessment for learning going, and particularly since it makes sense that you're working on how to improve, not just looking at what they can do, but how to improve. That's what schools are for. So, sorry, a long answer to a long question. So thank you very much for that one, Julia. Here's one by Twitter again. We've got Mark Waller again. The course has clear guidelines about how to create hinge point questions. It was less clear about intentional dialogue. Do you have any tips? Well, that's because when you're talking in classrooms, it's toing and froing. And so my tips are, get your questions organised before. So what we do when we're working with teachers is say, think of a topic that you're teaching next week, and then use our question stems. And question stems are things like what's similar and what's different about, or is it always true that, or why is this an example of that? Those sorts of question stems. And just invent a few questions using the stems for that topic. When you've invented them, then take a good look at them and think about what will my high attainers likely to say in response to that question? What are my low attainers who have difficulty accessing in likely to say? And what's that unusual child in my class who always sees things differently? What are they likely to say? And we mostly have at least one unusual child in our class, don't we? So what are they likely to say? If you're going to get 3 different answers in your head, it's going to be a brilliant question to get dialogue and intentional dialogue going. If you think they'll all answer the same, or some can answer and some can't, it probably isn't a good question to get that dialogue going. So it's finding ways of doing that and then working with it. And also you're equipping yourself with those sort of coaxing comments and questions. So things like saying to kids, tell me more, or what if I said, and then give them the sort of contrary view, or I've heard people think this, what do you think? And who can add to Yagnesh's answer? Or who's got a different answer that might challenge that? Those sorts of questions will really get the talk going. So it varies from class to class. It's not as clear cut as Hinge Point, because Hinge Point are a particular tool. The questions for intentional dialogue really are the sorts of things that go with the flow of things. It's what, again, on these two pan-European projects, my colleagues across Europe call on the fly. It's on the fly type questioning, where you've got to go with what they say and think, can I squeeze out really their understanding? And if you can get that, that's going to help me decide what to do next. So it's to stick, I agree, but there are tips. I'm sure other people have got other tips to do with that as well. Oh my goodness. Apparently we've got some data on who's actually listening in. We've got 334 UK people, 11 Iranians, 9 from Kazakhstan, some Peruvians. I've done AFL in Peru. There's quite a few schools there that we've worked with. 8 Kenyans, 11 Germans, 9 Dutch, 22 Swedes, 27 Americans. So we're actually spanning quite a few time zones. So those of you who are sort of in the early hours or just having breakfast, hi, welcome to it. We're in the evening here in England. But yeah, that's great to have all those people there, and amazing that we've got this interest that's so worldwide. So that's great. Let's hear more ideas coming in via Twitter or via the website. That would be absolutely great. So we've got, again, somebody via the Google Hangout here. This is Barnett Balerno, asking for what techniques do you use apart from making them experts to help others with the pupils who understand the concept? Yeah, I mean, using them as mini teachers is great, and I've seen that work really well, because it does really sort out their understanding when they're actually asked and challenged by others. But yeah, maybe you don't always want to do that. It might be the case that you actually have some alternative thing for them to do, so they go on to the next step, and you've got that planned out, and they can then come back and deliver that to the class, rather than you give it, or rather than looking it up on the internet or read it in a textbook. So they might do the next step and bring that back and help tie into the learning of the others. I've seen that work really well. Sometimes I've seen teachers get them to do research so that they can set up sort of a flip lesson for the other kids, or a homework for the other kids. I suppose that's using them as teachers again. And sometimes it's just, if you can get the others so involved with their activities, maybe you could spend some quality time with those who have got the concept, just to really give them that sort of extra, maybe wider breadth or more in-depth work that can sort of move them forward. So yeah, differentiation is always the one that is a difficulty sometimes to deal with. What AFL does is just make the differentiation needed so much more obvious. We can sort of ignore it a bit in whole class delivery type teaching. It just stands out so much when you're actually trying to get at what learners really do understand, or partly understand, or don't. So you do your best. I'm sure, again, other people have other great ideas of how they deal with that. So we've got Graham Crawford now. Similar question. He's a head of science. He's saying, what advice would you give on getting my reluctant colleagues to try AFL approaches? Well, what I've seen work, as I said earlier when Helen Rogerson sent in, is actually telling them little snippets of what you've actually seen some of your learners do, particularly if you've got some students who usually are not that great at learning, and suddenly through doing AFL, there's a little incident where they suddenly say something amazing, or ask an amazing question, or do something amazing. There's nothing that wins teachers over than seeing that kid that they thought was somewhat of an idiot in their lesson doing something really well in somebody else's lesson. We all want to do well by our kids, and those sorts of stories can really help. So certainly doing that. And what we find on projects that we do more recently, we've really focused on the professional learning side of assessment for learning, is when you start with, if you want to introduce it to your school, you start off with a small team of people who are the pioneers. They get it working, then they buddy up with somebody else, and then the pioneers, the buddies, they get it working. After a while, even the reluctant ones get dragged on board. because it becomes the main part of what you do, not something new. If nearly everybody's doing it, they all start doing it eventually because it becomes part of the practice. So that might be slightly more long term. That might be 18 months, 2-3 year project. One school it took 5 years, but they got there in the end through taking that approach of gradually bringing in more colleagues to do more of it. So that might help. Again, we've got Google Hangout. We've had this one a little bit before from Laura Davis. Do you think there's enough emphasis placed on AFL, in particular different functions of dialogue and interpoint questions in ITT? Well, if you are working in ITT, whether you're doing sort of postgraduate courses like most universities do, or Teach First, or School Direct, or whatever your type of courses in your country, we have written several workshops, usually 3-hour workshops, on assessment for learning, which I'm very happy to share with you. It's the ones we do at King's College London. Again, if you're a science person, through the Association for Science Education, the ATSI group, the Tutors for Science in Education, they've got some really good ideas and resources, so it's well worth getting in touch with them. But we can certainly help you with that if you are interested in doing that. There's also YouTube videos of some of our first projects, one called Secondary Assessment, if you want those, and they usually work out quite well when you work in ITT. Okay, Paolo Oprandi says, oh, so this is about teacher training again. So teacher training incorporates the theory of AFL, but not always used by the teachers of teachers. Shame. All right, come to my sessions, all right, and you'll find out what it means to be a learner. One of the things that we do is get our trainee teachers to understand it from the learner's perspective, because we sometimes see it different from the teacher's perspective. So yeah, if you're not doing that in ITT, you need to do it. Get in touch and I can help you with that. We're running out of time. Just got the last few coming now. So what we're going to take? We're going to take Belerno's, Barnett Belerno's question.
I've just got one there. Sorry, I've not got the name. It's C. McPherson.
Oh, I hope it's Claire McPherson, who's one of my old trainees, who's a great teacher. In your experience, has homework helped to address misconceptions? Would you recommend working on these in classroom only? I'd say probably. I don't know the research background on this, because I've not seen any on this, but my gut reaction is work on mainly in classrooms, maybe do some follow-up work through homework. But I would say work in classrooms first and get the dialogue and the discussions going first, and then possibly some homework activities. If anybody's done anything on that, let us know. Okay, I think we're about out of time, guys, so thank you very much, and bye for now.
I have one last question if you squeeze it in. I don't know. It's worth. It's Steve Kettle's just on there. It'll just wrap up what's coming up in the course.
All right, well, we have got a last question of the night. Sorry, one squeezed in by Steve Kettle. Well done, Steve. Is it worth creating a bank of effective responses to the misconceptions that hinge point questions identify? The answer to that is obviously yes. Can we do it? Andrea says yes, we can. We'll work on that. But yeah, that is good. It's one of those things, again, that's implicit in what we do. And sometimes we need to make it explicit if people haven't come across it. So yeah, thanks very much for that, Steve. Good question.
Good night.
Yeah, Andrew's coming in as well.
Just going to say good night. Thank you, everybody. We've tried to answer as many questions as we can. Chris has been amazing. Any that we've not addressed, we will make sure that we go through and answer afterwards. So thank you very much.
I'm sorry for talking so fast, but thanks for tuning in. Bye.
Thank you.